They say I was born into a world of ghosts, but I knew only abundance. My mother told me once, when I was old enough to understand, that the house we lived in had belonged to 3 other families before us. She said it as though confessing a sin, her voice dropping to a whisper even though we were alone in the garden. The Hendersons first, then the Clarks, then the widow Blackwell and her 7 children, all gone within a single summer, 16 years before I drew my first breath. The house had stood empty for a decade, slowly surrendering to ivy and rot, until my father claimed it simply by walking through the door with a hammer and a will to make it whole again. I did not understand why this should matter. The house was ours. The garden gave us beans and cabbages in such quantity that we sold the surplus at market. My father's workshop, built in what had once been a grain barn grand enough for a lord's estate, produced furniture of such quality that merchants came from Lincoln and even London to commission pieces. We were not wealthy, perhaps, but we wanted for nothing. This, I believed, was simply how the world worked. It was not until my 12th year that I began to comprehend the mathematics of my fortune. Master William, who taught the children of our village their letters, set us a problem one autumn morning. If a man owns 20 sheep, he said, and loses half to murrain, how many remain? Simple enough. But then Edmund Sawyer, the blacksmith's son, who sat beside me on the bench, raised his hand with an objection. "Begging your pardon, master, but my grandfather says before the pestilence, a man with 20 sheep would have been called poor. Now 20 sheep makes you a rich man. So the answer changes, doesn't it, depending on when you ask?" Master William's face did something complicated. He was himself an old man, perhaps 50, with skin like leather left too long in the sun, and I saw a shadow pass across his features that I had no name for then. Now I would call it memory made flesh. "You are correct, Edmund," he said quietly. 10 sheep today feeds a family that would have starved with 10 sheep before. But that is not a problem of arithmetic. That is a problem of history. We waited for him to explain, but he did not. Instead, he set us to practicing our letters, and I noticed his hand shook as he dipped his quill in ink. Later, I asked my mother what Master William had meant, and she told me something I had heard before, but never truly absorbed, that once, before the Great Dying, England had held perhaps 5 million souls. Now it held scarcely 2 million. More than half the people had simply vanished, as though God had reached down and plucked them from the earth like weeds from a garden. "But that was so long ago," I said, "before you were born even." 16 years before you, my mother agreed. "But only 4 years before me. I was born in 1354, when they were still burning bodies in pits, because there was no one left to dig proper graves." This struck me with peculiar force. My mother was young, barely 30, and yet she spoke of apocalypse with the same casual tone she used to discuss the weather or the price of wool. How could the world have ended, and then simply carried on unremarked, leaving people like me to grow up fat and ignorant in its aftermath? I began to pay attention differently after that. I began to notice the way my father would sometimes stop in the middle of his work, plane suspended above the wood, and stare at nothing with an expression I could not read. I began to notice how many houses in our village stood empty, how many field boundaries had been erased by creeping forest, how the old stone church could hold 300 souls, but our Sunday congregations numbered barely 60. I began to notice that almost everyone my parents' age or older had a certain look about them, not haunted exactly, but carved, as though something had taken a blade to their spirits and whittled away everything soft. And I began to understand that I was different, that my entire generation was different. We were the first children born into plenty rather than scarcity, the first to grow tall and strong without competition, the first to inherit a world that had been violently, terribly emptied to make room for us. We were the forgotten spring, budding green and thoughtless on the ruins of winter. The first time I truly understood what had been lost, I was helping my father deliver a wardrobe to a manor house some 20 miles distant. The journey took 2 days with the cart, and we stayed the night at an inn that stood at a crossroads, marked by an ancient stone cross, worn smooth by centuries of weather. The innkeeper was a woman of perhaps 45, lean and efficient, who served us mutton stew and bread so fresh it steamed when broken. The common room was nearly empty, just ourselves, a priest travelling to his new parish, and an old man who sat alone by the fire, staring into his ale as though it held the secrets of the universe. My father knew the innkeeper slightly, and they fell into easy conversation while I ate, but I found my attention drawn to the old man by the fire. He had the look of a former soldier, straight-backed despite his years, with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, turning his face into a geography of violence. And he was weeping silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his weathered cheeks. I had never seen a grown man cry. I stared, fascinated and appalled, until the innkeeper noticed and called across the room. "Don't mind old Thomas. He gets like this when he drinks. The memories come back." "What memories?" I asked, before my father could shush me. The innkeeper and my father exchanged a look. Then she sighed and came to sit at our table, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thomas was a wool merchant once," she said. "Had a wife, 6 children, a house in York that overlooked the Minster. Then the pestilence came in the summer of 1349, and by autumn he had buried them all, carried each body to the plague pit himself, because there was no one else to do it. Lost his mind for a while after that. When he came back to himself, he was as you see him now. He works for me, mending things and keeping the stables. Doesn't talk much, but he's a good man, just broken like so many of them." "But that was so long ago," I said, echoing my earlier conversation with my mother. "Surely he should have recovered by now." The innkeeper's expression hardened. Recovered? Boy, he lost everything. His children died in his arms, burning with fever and covered in buboes the size of apples. His wife died last, and he said she was relieved, because at least she'd be with the children again. How do you recover from that? How do you come back from the end of the world? I had no answer. My father placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "He doesn't understand, Margaret. How could he? The children born after, they inherit the plenty but not the pain. That's a mercy, I think." "Is it?" Margaret stood abruptly, gathering our empty bowls. "Sometimes I think it's worse, not to remember, not to understand what it cost. They come up thinking the world was always this way, that there was always enough land and food and work. They don't know how it was before, when every scrap had to be fought for. They don't know how many died so they could live easy." She stalked back to the kitchen, leaving us in uncomfortable silence. The priest, who had been listening quietly, cleared his throat. "The children of Israel forgot their bondage in Egypt within 2 generations, he said, his voice soft but clear. They forgot what it meant to be enslaved, because they had never been enslaved themselves. Your generation, boy, is like that. You are the children of the Exodus, born free in the wilderness, with no memory of the house of slavery." "But we remember that we were freed," I protested. "It's in the Bible. We tell the story." "Do you, though?" The priest smiled sadly. "Or do you hear the words without understanding them? Can you really comprehend what it means to be owned, body and soul, when you yourself have never been owned? Can you feel the weight of chains you have never worn?" I wanted to argue, but I could not, because he was right. When I heard the stories of the pestilence, and I had heard them in fragments and whispers all my life, they did not land in my heart. They were just stories, no more real than tales of dragons or far kingdoms. I could no more imagine the world my parents described than I could imagine flying to the moon. That night, lying on a straw pallet in the inn's loft, I listened to old Thomas moving about in the stable below, talking to the horses in a low, crooning voice. And I tried, really tried, to imagine what it would be like to lose everything, to bury your children one by one, to watch the world end around you, to survive into a future you never expected to see. I could not do it. My imagination failed me completely, and I wondered for the first time whether that failure was a blessing or a curse. The manor house where we delivered the wardrobe belonged to Sir Richard Ashford, a knight who had fought in France and returned with a French wife, and a limp he blamed on the mud at Crécy. He was perhaps 40, with the perpetually sunburned face of a man who preferred outdoors to in, and he greeted my father with the easy familiarity of someone who had commissioned work before. "Beaumont," he called as we rolled into the courtyard. Tell me you've outdone yourself this time. My wife has very particular standards, and I'll never hear the end of it if the wardrobe doesn't meet them." My father climbed down from the cart with a smile. "See for yourself, Sir Richard. Cherry wood with walnut inlay, exactly as specified. The panels depict the 4 seasons, and I think you'll find Lady Catherine's initials worked into the spring panel, if you look closely." Together they unwrapped the canvas covering, and I watched Sir Richard's face transform as he examined the piece. My father was a true craftsman, perhaps the finest woodworker in the county, and the wardrobe was a masterpiece. The panels glowed in the afternoon sun, the grain of the wood creating subtle patterns that enhanced, rather than distracted from the carved figures. A maiden gathering flowers for spring reapers in a field, for summer grape treaders, for autumn, and hunters in snow for winter. "It's extraordinary," Sir Richard breathed. He ran his fingers over the spring panel, tracing the hidden initials. "Catherine will be beside herself. Come, you must bring it inside yourself and show her. She's been anticipating this for weeks. We carried the wardrobe through the manor's main door, an operation requiring 6 men and considerable swearing, and into a bedroom on the upper floor that looked out over a formal garden. Lady Catherine met us there, a small woman with dark eyes and the musical accent of someone who still thought in French. "Ah," she exclaimed when she saw the wardrobe, "but this is magnificent. Monsieur Beaumont, you are an artist truly. In my father's house we had nothing so fine, and he was a baron." My father ducked his head, pleased and embarrassed. "You're very kind, my lady. I'm glad it meets your approval." "Meets it? It exceeds it entirely." She turned to her husband. "Richard, you must pay him double. This is work worthy of the king's own palace." "I'll pay him what we agreed, which is already generous," Sir Richard said dryly, but he was smiling. "Though I'll throw in dinner and a bed for the night if you'll accept it, Beaumont. It's too late to start back now, and I'd like to hear what news you have from the village." So we stayed, and that evening I found myself dining in a manor hall. Not at the high table with Sir Richard and his lady, of course, but at a lower table with the household servants and guards. It was still the finest meal I'd ever eaten. Roasted capon and venison, white bread instead of brown, and wine so good I understood for the first time why people wrote poetry about it. The conversation turned inevitably to the subject that seemed to lurk beneath every discussion: the world that was and the world that is. "My father," said a man-at-arms named John, "used to tell me about the old days before the pestilence. Said this hall would have had 40 people eating in it every night, servants and soldiers and all their families. Now what do we have? 10? 12? Fewer mouths to feed means more for each mouth," observed the cook, a stout woman named Bess. "I'll take that trade any day. Used to be you could work yourself to the bone and still go hungry. Now everyone eats like lords, relatively speaking." "But is that right?" asked another guard, younger than John. "I mean, we're eating food meant for people who aren't here anymore, dead people's shares. Doesn't that trouble you?" "Why should it?" Bess shrugged. "They're dead, we're alive, someone has to eat the food." "My mother says it's God's judgment," said a serving girl barely older than me. "That the pestilence was sent to punish wickedness, and those who survived were the righteous ones. That's why we prosper now, because the wicked are gone." This caused an uncomfortable silence. Finally, John spoke, his voice careful. "I knew plenty of good people who died, and plenty of wicked ones who lived. If it was God's judgment, his aim was poor. Maybe it wasn't about good or wicked," I heard myself say. Everyone turned to look at me, and I felt my face heat. But I continued, "Maybe it was just chance. Like Master William says about the sheep in the moraine, sometimes animals just die. Maybe people are the same." "Careful, boy," John said, but not unkindly. "That's close to heresy. The Church teaches that nothing happens without God's will." "The Church teaches a lot of things," muttered Bess, then crossed herself quickly. "Begging pardon. Shouldn't speak ill of holy matters." Later, as I lay in the servants' quarters listening to the snores and rustles of sleeping bodies around me, I thought about what the serving girl had said, that the survivors were righteous, that prosperity was a reward for virtue. It troubled me because I knew it wasn't true. Old Thomas the wool merchant, weeping into his ale, was he wicked? Were his 6 children wicked? And if they weren't, if they were good people who simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, then what did that mean? That God was cruel, that he didn't care, or that he didn't exist at all. These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that could get you branded a heretic if spoken aloud. But I was 12 years old and beginning to understand that the world was vastly more complicated than anyone had told me. That the simple stories we told ourselves about justice and providence and deserved rewards were just that, stories. Comforting lies we whispered in the dark to keep the chaos at bay. And I wondered what it meant to build a life on foundations you knew were false. The turning point in my understanding came a year later, when the sweating sickness arrived. It came in high summer, when the wheat was almost ready for harvest and the world hummed with the drowsy contentment of abundance. One day, there was nothing. The next day, Peter Fuller collapsed in his workshop, drenched in sweat and complaining of a headache. By evening, he was dead. By the end of the week, 23 people in our village had followed him. It was not the pestilence. No buboes, no blackened flesh, no lingering agony. The sweating sickness killed differently, fast and democratic, taking the young and healthy as readily as the old and infirm. You could wake up feeling fine and be dead by dinner. The speed of it created a strange, dreamlike panic. My mother made us drink nettle tea every morning, convinced it would protect us. My father stopped going to his workshop, afraid to encounter anyone who might be carrying the contagion. Master William closed the school. The church bells tolled almost continuously as Father Benedict rushed from deathbed to deathbed, administering last rites to people who 12 hours earlier had been bargaining over the price of eggs. And for the first time in my life, I was afraid. Not the momentary fear of a barking dog or a thunderstorm, but the deep, existential terror of understanding that death was not something that happened to other people in stories long ago. It was here. It was now. It could take me as easily as it had taken Peter Fuller, who was only 19 and engaged to be married, and had never done anything worse than steal apples from Widow March's orchard. I began to understand what my parents' generation had lived through. Not fully. I would never understand fully, because 3 weeks of sickness is not the same as 3 years, and 23 deaths is not the same as hundreds of thousands. But I got a glimpse, at least, a taste of apocalypse, and I saw how it changed people. Edmund Sawyer, the blacksmith's son, became convinced that God was punishing us for our prosperity, for living too well on the dead's legacy. He started giving away his possessions, his tools, his spare clothes, his father's savings, to anyone who would take them. He stopped eating anything but bread and water. His father tried to stop him, but Edmund had a convert's fervor and could not be reasoned with. "Don't you see?" he shouted in the village square one afternoon, his voice raw. "We've been living in sin, taking what wasn't ours, eating food meant for mouths that are gone, sleeping in houses we didn't build and fields we didn't clear. God is angry, and he's right to be angry. We have to repent before it's too late." But others reacted differently. John Baker, whose wife had died in the first week, began drinking before noon and didn't stop until he passed out at night. Mary Cooper, who lost her only daughter, simply stopped speaking. She would stare at you when you addressed her, clearly understanding, but no words would come. She moved through the world like a ghost, present but not participating. And still others, like my father, simply worked harder. He returned to his workshop despite the danger, driving himself to exhaustion, producing furniture at a pace I'd never seen. When I asked why, he said, "Because if I stop working, I'll start thinking, and I can't afford to think right now." I didn't understand that at the time. Now I do. Thinking means confronting the abyss, means acknowledging that everything you love can be taken in an instant, for no reason, without warning or justice. Work is a refuge from that knowledge. Work is a way to pretend the world makes sense. The sweating sickness lasted a month and then vanished as mysteriously as it had come. 23 dead out of a village of perhaps 200. A tragedy, certainly, but nothing compared to the pestilence. And yet it felt catastrophic because we had not expected it. We had grown comfortable. We had forgotten that we lived in a world that could kill us at any moment. The first Sunday after the sickness passed, Father Benedict preached a sermon I still remember. He was an old man, one of the few priests who had survived the pestilence, and his voice had the weight of experience. "My children," he said, "you have been reminded this month of something your parents' generation never forgot, that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. That all our prosperity and comfort are temporary gifts, to be held lightly and relinquished without complaint when the Lord calls us home. This is not a new lesson, it is the oldest lesson, but every generation must learn it anew, written in their own flesh and blood." He paused, and his eyes swept over us, the young and the old, the survivors and the bereaved, the generation born before the pestilence and the generation born after. "There is a danger," he continued, "in prosperity. It makes us soft. It makes us forget our dependence on God's mercy. Those of you who were born after the great dying, and I see many of you here, have grown up in a world of relative ease. You have land aplenty. You have food and work and opportunity. You have not known the hunger and desperation that your parents knew, and this is good. This is a blessing, but it is also a test. The test is this: can you be grateful without being complacent? Can you prosper without forgetting where prosperity comes from? Can you build a good life while remembering that it could all vanish tomorrow?" He looked directly at me then, though perhaps I only imagined it. "Your parents' generation was forged in fire. They learned hard lessons about suffering and survival. You, the children born after, must learn different lessons. Lessons about responsibility and gratitude and the proper use of fortune. Your task is to build something lasting from the ruins you inherited, to create a world worthy of those who died to make room for you." It was the first time anyone had spoken about us, my generation, as having a purpose, as having a duty. Until that moment, I had thought of my life as simply mine, to be lived as I pleased. But Father Benedict was saying something different. He was saying that we owed a debt. But to whom? To the dead? How do you repay the dead? They don't want anything. They're beyond wanting. After the service, I asked my mother this question. She considered it carefully before answering. "You repay them," she said, "by not wasting what they left, by building something good and true, by remembering them, not in sadness but in gratitude, by living well." "But I didn't know them," I protested. "How can I be grateful to people I never met?" "You live in their houses," my mother said. "You eat food grown in their fields. You walk roads they paved and pray in churches they built. Everything you have, everything you are, exists because they existed first. That's the debt. And the payment is simply this: don't squander it." It would be many years before I fully understood what she meant, but that conversation planted a seed that would eventually blossom into something like wisdom. When I was 15, my father took me to London. It was my first visit to the great city, and I expected marvels. Towering buildings, thronging crowds, the Thames flowing bright and busy with commerce. What I found instead was a haunted place, magnificent and melancholy in equal measure. The city was too large for its population. That was the first thing I noticed. Streets that could have accommodated hundreds of people held perhaps a dozen. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, the houses slowly collapsing into themselves, reclaimed by rats and weather. The great walls that encircled the city had been built for a population of 80,000. Now London held scarcely 30,000, rattling around inside those walls like dried peas in a barrel. And yet, paradoxically, those 30,000 lived better than the 80,000 had before. The surviving merchants were wealthy beyond their ancestors' dreams, trading goods that had once been luxuries as common necessities. The guilds, desperate for members, accepted apprentices with minimal fees and granted journeyman status in record time. Labourers commanded wages that would have been unthinkable before the pestilence, and landlords competed for tenants instead of the reverse. We stayed with a cousin of my father's, a joiner named Thomas who had a workshop near Cheapside. He was perhaps 35, successful and bitter in equal measure. "This city is a graveyard," he told us over dinner the first evening. "Oh, it's a wealthy graveyard, I'll grant you that. I make more in a month now than my father made in a year before the pestilence. But it's still a graveyard. Everywhere you look, you see ghosts. Ghosts? I asked. Not literal ghosts, boy, though some swear they've seen them. Spirits of the plague, dead, wandering the empty streets at night. No, I mean memories. Echoes. This workshop, for instance. He gestured around the room, which was large and well appointed. It belonged to my master before. He trained 15 apprentices in his time, had journeymen coming from France and Flanders to learn his techniques. When the pestilence came, it killed him, both his journeymen and 12 of the 15 apprentices. I was one of the 3 who survived, and when it was over I inherited all of this, the workshop, the tools, the commissions, the reputation, simply by virtue of not being dead. But surely that's good fortune, my father said. You were able to establish yourself much younger than you otherwise would have. Oh, it's fortune, certainly. But is it good fortune? I ask myself that sometimes, when I'm working late and the candles make shadows dance on the walls. I'm living a life that should have belonged to someone else, sleeping in a bed someone else bought, using tools someone else made, fulfilling contracts someone else negotiated. I'm not really Thomas Ashfield the joiner. I'm just whoever was still standing when the music stopped. A placeholder, a substitute. He took a long drink of wine, and I saw that his hand was shaking slightly. Do you know what the worst part is? I was 16 when the pestilence came, and I was relieved. Not at first, not when people were dying, don't mistake me, but afterward, when I realized what it meant for me. No more years of apprenticeship ahead, no more scrabbling for every penny, no more wondering if I'd ever be able to afford to marry or have a family. The whole world opened up just like that, and I was relieved. What kind of person is relieved by apocalypse? No one answered him. My father looked uncomfortable, and I stared at my plate, not knowing what to say. But Thomas wasn't really looking for an answer. He poured himself more wine and continued. Your generation, boy, he said, nodding at me, is different. You were born into this. You never knew anything else. You think this is normal, all this land and opportunity and prosperity. You don't carry the guilt. What guilt? I asked. The guilt of inheriting blood money, of building your life on a foundation of corpses, of being glad, even a little bit, even secretly, that people died so you could live better. He laughed, a harsh sound. But you don't feel that because you weren't there. You're innocent. Lucky, lucky innocence. That night, lying on a pallet in Thomas's workshop, I thought about what he'd said, about guilt and inheritance and the price of prosperity. And I wondered if he was right, if my generation truly was innocent, or if we were simply too young and ignorant to understand our complicity. The next day, my father took me to see St. Paul's Cathedral. It dominated the London skyline, a massive stone testimony to faith and ambition, and even half empty, it was awe-inspiring. We arrived during Mass, and I was struck by the contrast between the cathedral's capacity and its congregation. The building could hold thousands. It held perhaps 300. Afterward, we met with a priest who was a friend of my father's from childhood. Father Michael was in his 30s, lean and intense, with the look of someone who burned with an inner fire. The church, he told us as we walked through the cathedral's echoing spaces, has been forced to reckon with difficult questions since the pestilence. Questions about suffering and justice, about God's purposes and human deserving. The easy answers. That plague was punishment for sin, that survivors were righteous. Those answers satisfied people for a while. But they don't hold up under examination. Too many good people died. Too many wicked people survived. So what is the answer? I asked. Father Michael smiled sadly. If I knew that, I'd be Pope. The truth is, we don't know. We can't know. God's purposes are not ours to understand. What we can do, what we must do, is respond with grace and gratitude, to accept what has been given, terrible and wonderful both, and make something worthwhile from it. But how? The question burst from me with unexpected force. How are we supposed to do that? We're just people. We didn't ask for any of this. We didn't earn it. We were just born at the right time. Exactly, Father Michael said. You were born at the right time. Not by your choice, but by God's providence, and that places a responsibility on you. You have been given something precious, a world with room to grow, with resources to spare, with opportunities your grandparents couldn't have imagined. The question is, what will you do with it? I had no answer, but the question stayed with me, working its way deeper into my consciousness like a seed into soil. We spent 3 more days in London, and each day I saw more of the strange, contradictory reality the pestilence had created. I saw beggars dressed in silk scavenged from abandoned houses. I saw a market where 3 bakers competed for customers when once there had been 20. I saw a great house, magnificent as a palace, inhabited by a single elderly couple and their 2 servants. I saw wealth and waste, opportunity and emptiness, all tangled together in ways that defied easy judgment. On our last evening, Thomas took us to a tavern near the river. It was crowded, one of the few places in London that felt alive, and the mood was raucous. Men drank and laughed and sang, their voices rising in songs I didn't recognize. "This is the real London," Thomas said, raising his voice to be heard over the din. "This is where people come to forget, to stop thinking about all the empty houses and dead dreams, to pretend just for a few hours that the world is normal." But I noticed he wasn't drinking, wasn't singing. He sat slightly apart, watching the revelry with the expression of someone observing a foreign ritual. "Don't you want to join them?" I asked. "I can't," he said simply. "I've tried. God knows I've tried. But I can't forget. I see their faces sometimes, the people who died. My master, my fellow apprentices. They were real people, with hopes and plans and futures that were stolen from them. And I'm living the life one of them should have lived. How do I forget that? How do I pretend it doesn't matter?" My father, who had been quiet all evening, finally spoke. "You can't forget, Thomas, but you can honor them. By living well, by doing good work, by being worthy of the gift you were given." "Is that enough?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," my father admitted, "but it's all we have." I apprenticed to my father when I turned 16, surprising no one. I had a gift for woodwork, a natural understanding of how grain and joint and tension work together to create something both beautiful and functional. Under my father's tutelage, I grew skilled quickly, and within 2 years, I was doing work that would have taken 5 years to achieve in the old world before the pestilence. This was the pattern of our generation: advancement without obstacle, opportunity without competition. We became journeymen at 20, where our grandparents had been journeymen at 30. We married younger, had more children, built larger houses, and accumulated more wealth. We were, by any objective measure, the most fortunate generation in English history. And yet there was something hollow about it. Or perhaps I only felt that hollowness because I had been taught to feel it, because I carried in my mind the ghost of Thomas the Joiner and his talk of guilt and inheritance. When I was 19, I fell in love with a girl named Alice. She was the daughter of a yeoman farmer, blessed with land and livestock far beyond what her grandfather could have imagined owning. She was clever and kind and laughed easily, and when I was with her I forgot, temporarily, all the complicated questions about debt and duty and deserving. We married when I was 20, and I built us a house on land my father gave me, land that had once supported 3 families before. The house was large and fine, with glass windows and a proper chimney, luxuries that most people of my grandparents' generation never knew. Alice filled it with her laughter and her weaving, and eventually with children. Our first child, a son, was born in the winter of 1377. We named him William after Alice's father. He was healthy and strong, and I remember looking at him in his cradle and thinking, "This child will never know scarcity. He will never go hungry. He will never wonder if there's enough land or work or opportunity for him. He will grow up thinking abundance is normal, is natural, is the way the world works." And I was glad of that. But I was also troubled by it, though I couldn't articulate why. The answer came to me one evening when William was perhaps 6 months old. I was working late in the workshop, putting the final touches on a chest commissioned by a merchant in Norwich. Alice had gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the occasional cry from William's room and the soft sounds of my playing against wood. I was thinking about the future, William's future, when I realized what troubled me. It was this: my son would never understand sacrifice. He would never comprehend scarcity. He would grow up in a world so different from his grandparents' world that their experiences would be incomprehensible to him. And that gap, that failure of understanding, would only grow wider with each generation. Eventually, perhaps within 2 or 3 more generations, the pestilence would be forgotten entirely. It would become just another historical event, studied by scholars but meaningless to ordinary people. The Great Dying would be reduced to a date, a statistic, a footnote, and all the suffering and loss and grief would be erased, as though it had never happened. This felt wrong to me. It felt like betrayal. But I didn't know how to prevent it. How do you make people remember something they never experienced? How do you preserve the weight of history when the people who carry that weight die? I brought this question to Father Benedict one Sunday after Mass. He was very old now, bent and slow, but his mind was still sharp. "You're asking," he said, "how to create memory in those who have none. It's an old question. Every generation faces it. The Israelites faced it after the Exodus, trying to teach their children what slavery meant when those children had never been enslaved. The Romans faced it as they lost their republic and gained their empire. Every transition creates this gap. But what's the answer, I asked. There isn't one answer, Father Benedict said. Only many small answers, each imperfect. You tell stories, you build monuments, you create rituals that encode memory in action rather than just words. You make the past present somehow, even to those who never lived it. But will it work? I pressed. Will William understand? Will his children? Father Benedict was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Probably not. Not the way you understand. Not the way I understand. But that's not failure. That's simply time. Memory fades. Pain heals. The world moves forward. And that's as it should be. The alternative is to be like old Thomas at the crossroads, weeping into his ale for the rest of his life. Is that better?" I thought of Thomas, whom I had not seen since that night at the inn years ago. I thought of my cousin Thomas in London, unable to join in the tavern's revelry. I thought of all the people of my parents' generation who carried their scars invisibly, who functioned but never quite healed. "No," I admitted, "that's not better." "Then accept what must be accepted," Father Benedict said gently. "Teach your son what you can. Tell him the stories. Help him understand that his ease was purchased with suffering. But don't expect him to feel what you feel, or to carry the weight you carry. That weight is yours. His weight will be different." "What will his weight be?" "I don't know. Whatever challenges his time brings. Every generation has its burdens. Yours is to build on ruins and feel guilty about the building. His may be to maintain what you built and feel guilty about the ease of it. Or perhaps his challenges will be entirely different. New plagues, new wars, new disasters we cannot imagine. The future is always uncertain." This should have been discouraging, but somehow it wasn't. There was comfort in the idea that my struggle to understand and honor the past, while important, was not everything. That William would have his own struggles, his own questions, his own weight to carry. That each generation faced its own tests and either passed or failed them on their own merits. The years passed, as years do. William grew into a bright, curious boy who asked endless questions about everything. Alice bore us 2 more children, a daughter we named Catherine, and another son, Thomas, named for my troubled cousin in London. The workshop prospered. I took on 2 apprentices, boys from the village who showed talent and interest. Life was good, but the world beyond our village was not static. Events were unfolding that would eventually touch even our quiet corner of England. In 1381, when William was 4, the Great Revolt broke out. Peasants and labourers, emboldened by decades of rising wages and growing power, rose up against the old order. They marched on London demanding the end of serfdom and the poll tax. They killed nobles and lawyers and tax collectors. For a few brief, terrifying days, it seemed the entire social order might collapse. The revolt was crushed, of course. The king's forces rallied, the leaders were executed, and order was restored. But nothing was quite the same afterward. The message had been sent and received. The common people knew their worth now. They would not return to the old ways willingly. My father, hearing news of the revolt, said something that stuck with me. "This is what the pestilence truly wrought. Not just death, but transformation. The world that existed before, where a man's birth determined his entire life, where the poor knew their place and kept to it. That world died with the plague victims. We're living in something new now, and no one quite knows the rules yet. He was right. The old certainties had dissolved. Sons of peasants became merchants. Servants married their employers' daughters. Land that had been held by the same family for generations passed to strangers. The social fabric, which had seemed eternal and unchangeable, proved to be as fragile as human flesh. And my generation, born into this fluidity, took it for granted. We could not imagine a world where your birth determined everything, where mobility was impossible, where questioning your station was unthinkable. To us, the ability to rise or fall based on merit and luck seemed natural. We could not comprehend how revolutionary this truly was. When William was 7, I tried to explain it to him. We were walking through the fields that had once been divided among dozens of families, but now belonged entirely to Alice's father. William had asked why the old boundary stones still stood, partially hidden by grass and weeds, marking divisions that no longer mattered. "Before you were born," I told him, "before I was born, this land was different. Each of those stones marked where one family's land ended and another's began. And each family had just enough land to survive on if they worked hard and the weather was good. If the weather was bad, people starved." William frowned, trying to understand. "But there's so much land, why didn't they just use more?" "Because there were more people then. Many more. And all the land was already claimed. There was no more to use." "Where did the people go?" "They died. A sickness came and killed them. More than half of all the people in England died within a few years." William was quiet, absorbing this. Then he asked, "Did you know them? The people who died?" "No. It happened before I was born. But my parents knew them. My mother was just a baby when it happened, but she grew up in the world right after. She remembers when these fields were full of people working, when every house was occupied, when there was never enough of anything." "It must have been terrible," William said. "It was. The worst thing that ever happened, probably. But it's also why we have what we have. If all those people hadn't died, you and I wouldn't have this land. I wouldn't have my workshop. We'd be much poorer, struggling to survive like everyone did before." William considered this with the seriousness children sometimes bring to difficult topics. "So it was bad for them, but good for us?" "Yes, exactly." I paused, trying to find the right words. "And that's complicated, isn't it? We benefit from their suffering. We live in their empty houses and farm their abandoned fields. And we should remember that. We should be grateful and use what we've been given wisely. Do you understand?" "I think so," William said. But I could see he didn't, not really. How could he? To him, the prosperous world he inhabited was simply reality, not a strange aberration built on catastrophe. The empty houses were just empty, not haunted. The abundant land was just abundant, not blood-soaked. I tried not to feel frustrated by his incomprehension. Father Benedict was right. Each generation understood what it could understand and no more. My task was not to make William feel what I felt, but simply to plant seeds of understanding that might eventually grow into wisdom. When I was 30, my father died. Not of plague or sweating sickness or any of the dramatic killers that had shaped his generation, but simply of a fall from a ladder. He was working on a large wardrobe, still taking commissions at 60, still as exacting as ever, when the ladder shifted. He fell badly, striking his head on a workbench. He never regained consciousness. It was a stupid, mundane death, the kind that could happen to anyone in any era. And yet it felt wrong somehow. My father had survived the pestilence, had lived through the end of the world, and built a good life in its aftermath, and then he died because of a poorly placed ladder. Where was the meaning in that? Where was the proportion? But of course, that was the point. There was no meaning. Death came when it came, for reasons profound or trivial, and it made no difference whether you deserved it or had earned it, or could make a compelling argument for why you should be spared. The pestilence had taught that lesson on a massive scale, and my father's death taught it again on a personal one. We buried him in the churchyard, in ground that held layers of dead, ancient parishioners from before the pestilence, victims of the great dying buried hastily in mass graves, and more recent dead like my father, returned to earth with proper ceremony. Standing at the graveside, I thought about all those layers, all that accumulated death beneath our feet. and I understood something new. The dead don't just vanish. They don't disappear into nothing, leaving the world unchanged. They become part of the foundation. They become the ground on which the living stand. Every generation builds on the graves of those who came before, whether they acknowledge it or not. My father had built on the graves of pestilence victims. I was building on his grave. William would build on mine, and so on, forward into a future I couldn't imagine, each generation rising a little higher on the accumulated dead. Was that beautiful or terrible? I couldn't decide. Perhaps it was both. My mother at the funeral seemed smaller than I remembered, diminished by grief. But her eyes were dry, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "He had a good life," she said. "Better than he had any right to expect, given when he was born. He was 4 years old when the pestilence came. Do you know how rare it was for a child that age to survive? Most of them died in the first wave, but he lived, and he built something, and now you carry it forward." "I don't know if I can," I admitted. "He was so skilled, so certain. I feel like I'm still learning." "You are still learning. You'll always be learning. That's not weakness, that's wisdom." She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your father spent his whole life trying to prove he deserved to survive. Every beautiful piece he made was an argument for his existence, but you don't have that burden. You were born into a world where survival was assumed, not something you had to earn. That's a gift. Use it." I thought about this often in the months that followed. About burden and gift, about debt and freedom. I had inherited my father's workshop, his tools, his commissions, his reputation. But I had also inherited something less tangible, his need to justify himself through work, his sense that he owed something to the dead, his inability to simply enjoy what he had. I decided, slowly and not without difficulty, that I would not pass that burden to William. I would teach him the craft, yes. I would teach him about the past and the price that had been paid for his prosperity. But I would not teach him that he needed to earn his existence. I would not saddle him with survivor's guilt for surviving something that happened before he was born. This felt like betrayal somehow, like I was diminishing what my father's generation had endured by failing to preserve their trauma. But I remembered Father Benedict's words, "The weight is yours. His weight will be different." And I thought, perhaps that's what progress is. Not just technological advance or growing wealth, but the gradual lifting of old weights, old guilts, old fears. Perhaps each generation's task is not to preserve the trauma of those who came before, but to metabolize it, to transform it into something that strengthens without crushing. The plague returned when I was 35. Not the Great Pestilence, that specific horror never came back, thank God, but a cousin of it, familiar enough to recognize, different enough to sow fresh terror. It came in spring, just as the apple trees were blooming, and it killed perhaps 1 person in 20 who caught it. 1 in 20. In the old world, before the Great Dying, this would have been catastrophic. An entire generation would have been traumatized. But we were not the old world. We were the world after. And so, while we grieved our dead and took precautions and prayed fervently for deliverance, we were not apocalyptic about it. We had space for the losses. We had reserves to fall back on. The social fabric, which had been stretched so thin in the Great Pestilence that it nearly tore, now had enough slack to absorb this new strain without breaking. My children all survived. Alice and I survived. Most people we knew survived, and within 6 months, life had returned to something like normal. This time I understood what old Thomas had meant about being relieved by catastrophe. Because there was a part of me, a part I was ashamed to acknowledge, that was almost grateful for the plague. Not for the deaths themselves, God forbid, but for the reminder, for the proof that we were not immune, not special, not guaranteed prosperity forever. It sounds monstrous, written out like that, but I think it's simply human. We need reminders of our mortality, our fragility. Without them, we become complacent. We start to believe we're invulnerable, and that belief makes us careless, wasteful, arrogant. The plague, this small plague, this manageable plague, was a correction, a reminder that the world could still hurt us, that we needed to remain humble, grateful, careful. William, now 11, reacted to the plague with a child's adaptability. It was frightening while it lasted, but once it passed, he moved on. He did not develop Thomas's guilt, or Edmund Sawyer's religious fervor, or Mary Cooper's traumatized silence. He simply incorporated the experience into his understanding of how the world worked. Sometimes people got sick and died. It was sad but not apocalyptic, and continued growing. This seemed healthy to me. This seemed right. And yet there was still a part of me that wondered if something important was being lost. If the ability to move on quickly, to not be devastated by loss, represented a kind of spiritual thinning. If resilience and callousness were closer cousins than we like to admit. I discussed this with Father Benedict, who was still alive at 80-something, a fact that astonished everyone, including himself. "You're worried," he said, "that your son is not wounded enough by suffering, that his ability to recover means he hasn't learned the proper lessons." "Yes," I admitted. "When the pestilence came back, I thought it would be like the sweating sickness was for me, a revelation, an awakening. But for William, it was just an event, something that happened and then ended." "And you think that's a failure of character?" "I don't know, is it?" Father Benedict laughed, a wheezing sound. "My boy, you're asking me to condemn a child for being resilient, for not being traumatized, for responding to suffering in a healthy way? Do you hear how absurd that is? But shouldn't he be marked by it? Shouldn't he understand?" "He understands what he needs to understand for his time and place," Father Benedict interrupted. "You keep trying to make him carry weights from a different era. You want him to feel what your parents felt, what their generation felt. But he's not them. He's him. And the fact that he can experience loss without being destroyed by it is a sign of health, not sickness." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't, because he was right. I was trying to preserve trauma as though it were a virtue, as though being wounded was proof of depth. But wounds are just wounds. They don't make you better or wiser or more worthy. They just make you hurt. The question, Father Benedict continued, is not whether William feels enough pain. The question is whether he has learned compassion, gratitude, and responsibility. Does he care about others? Is he grateful for what he has? Does he use his advantages to build rather than destroy? Those are the things that matter. And does he, I asked, have those things? I think so. From what I've seen, yes. He's a good boy. Kind, thoughtful, hard-working. He'll make a fine man. Father Benedict paused, then added, "But you won't stop worrying about him. That's what parents do. You'll worry that he's too soft or too hard, too serious or too frivolous, too much like you or not enough like you. That worry doesn't mean anything except that you love him." This conversation freed something in me. I stopped trying to force William to feel what I felt or understand what I understood. I simply let him be himself, growing in his own direction at his own pace. And I watched with mixed pride and melancholy as he grew into someone fundamentally different from me. Someone who took abundance for granted because abundance was all he'd known. Someone who didn't carry invisible weights from eras he'd never lived through. Someone lighter, freer, unburdened by historical guilt. Was this loss or gain? I still couldn't say, but I was beginning to think it didn't matter. The world moved forward regardless of my judgment. Time did its work whether I approved or not. In my 40th year, something happened that changed my understanding of everything. I was working in the shop one afternoon when a stranger arrived, a man in his 60s, dusty from travel, with the weathered look of someone who had seen much and forgotten little. He asked if I was Robert Beaumont, son of John Beaumont, and when I confirmed that I was, he said, "I knew your grandfather." This was unexpected. My grandfather had died in the pestilence when my father was 4. I had never known him, never even heard much about him. He was just a name, a gap in the family history. "He was my master," the stranger explained. "I was his apprentice. My name is Walter. I left England after the pestilence. Couldn't bear to stay with everyone I knew dead or changed. I've been in France these 30-odd years, working as a joiner in Lyon. But I'm old now, and I wanted to come home before I died. I wanted to see what became of the places I knew, the people I knew." He looked around the workshop with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This was your grandfather's workshop," He built it with his own hands. I helped him. We raised that main beam there on a Tuesday in May, 35 years before the pestilence came. I can still remember him singing while we worked. I felt something shift inside me. This workshop, my workshop, suddenly had a history beyond my father's death. It had roots that went back into a world I'd only heard about, a world before the end. What was he like? I asked. My grandfather? Walter sat down on a workbench, uninvited but not unwelcome. He was a good master, patient, skilled, fair. He trained 6 apprentices that I know of, maybe more. He had a wife, your grandmother, and 4 children. Your father was the youngest. What happened to the others, the other children? Dead. All dead in the pestilence, your grandmother too. Your grandfather watched them die one after another over the course of 2 weeks. Then he died himself. I was there when he went. His last words were... Walter paused, eyes distant with memory. He said, "Tell my son I'm sorry." I never understood what he meant by that. Sorry for dying. Sorry for leaving him alone. But I remember it. My hands had stopped moving. I was gripping a chisel hard enough that my knuckles whitened. He lived here in this workshop? Above it. There were rooms upstairs, a whole family's worth of space. After he died, the workshop stood empty for years. Then your father claimed it. I heard about that before I left England, how little John Beaumont had grown up and taken his father's place. It gave me hope, somehow, that something continued. Walter stood and walked to the wall where my tools hung. "This plane," he said, touching one reverently. "I made this. I made it here, in this workshop, under your grandfather's instruction. I was 15. It was the first tool I ever made on my own, and I was so proud of it. When I left England, I left it behind. Couldn't bear to take it with me, and here it is, still here." He turned to look at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Do you know what it means to me, seeing this, knowing that something survived, that the work continued, that the craft was passed down, that your grandfather's workshop is still a workshop and not a ruin or a tavern or someone is stable?" I didn't know what to say. I had never thought about the workshop as something that survived. It was just where I worked, where my father had worked. It was present, not past. But Walter was showing me that it was both, that the present was layered over the past like paint over wood, and if you looked closely, you could see the grain showing through. "Stay," I said impulsively. "Stay for dinner. Stay the night. Tell me about my grandfather. Tell me about the world before." And he did. That night, sitting by the fire with Alice and the children listening, Walter talked for hours. He described a workshop crowded with apprentices, a village so full of people you could barely walk through the market square, fields divided into strips so narrow you could jump across them. He described a world of scarcity and hierarchy and rigid boundaries, where who you were born determined who you would die, where hunger was a constant companion and ambition a luxury few could afford. But he also described beauty, communal festivals that involved whole villages, work songs sung by dozens of voices in harmony, a sense of shared purpose and mutual dependence that had been lost when half the people disappeared. He described his master, my grandfather, teaching him to feel the grain of wood with his eyes closed, to understand its character before ever setting blade to it. He described a kind of knowledge that was passed hand to hand, master to apprentice, in an unbroken chain stretching back to Roman times or before. "And is that chain broken now?" I asked. Walter considered this. Yes and no. The chain broke in the pestilence. So many masters died, so much knowledge was lost, but new chains formed. Your father learned from your grandfather before he died, yes? And you learned from your father, and you'll teach your son. The chain is different now, thinner, newer, with fewer links, but it's still a chain. The craft continues. "But it's not the same," I said. "It's not the same. How could it be? The world changed. The old ways died with the old world, but that doesn't mean what we have now is worse. It's just different." He smiled. "In some ways it's better. You have opportunities I never dreamed of. Your son will have opportunities you can't imagine. That's not betrayal, that's progress." William, who had been listening quietly from the corner, spoke up. "But don't you miss it, the way it was before?" Walter looked at him with something like tenderness. Every day, child, every single day. But missing something doesn't mean it should come back. The world before the pestilence was hard and cruel in ways you can't understand. Yes, it had beauty and community and traditions I loved, but it also had grinding poverty and rigid hierarchies and lives crushed by circumstance. I miss it, but I don't wish it back. What do you wish? William asked. I wish, Walter said slowly, that people like you could understand what was lost without having to lose anything yourself. That you could have empathy without trauma, memory without pain. I wish you could honor the past without being chained to it. He paused. But mostly I wish you'll use what you've been given well, that you'll build something good from what we left you. That's all any generation can hope for from the next. No. After Walter left, he stayed 3 days working in the shop with me, teaching me techniques my grandfather had taught him. I thought a great deal about chains, about continuity and rupture, about how traditions both bind and liberate. I had thought of myself as disconnected from the past, born into a new world with no connection to the old. But Walter had shown me that wasn't true. I carried my grandfather's blood, worked in his workshop, used tools he had touched. The past was not gone. It was present, woven into the fabric of my daily life so completely I hadn't even noticed it. And my children would carry that past forward whether they knew it or not. They would use techniques I taught them, work with tools I made, inhabit patterns of thought and work I had instilled. The chain would continue, link by link, even as it changed. This felt important, though I struggled to articulate why. It had something to do with the question I'd been wrestling with since childhood. What do we owe the dead? What responsibility do we have to those who came before? The answer, I was beginning to think, was not guilt or preservation of trauma, or keeping the world forever in mourning. The answer was simpler and harder: continuation with honor. We owed the dead the dignity of being remembered, the respect of having their work continued, and the tribute of building something worth building on their foundation. But we did not owe them stagnation. We did not owe them perfect replication. We did not owe them our lives in servitude to their memory. We owed them good work, good lives, good faith effort to make something worthwhile. That was all. That was everything. When William was 16, I took him to London, just as my father had taken me. We stayed again with my cousin Thomas, who was now in his 50s, still successful, still bitter, still unable to shake the feeling that he was living a borrowed life. But something had changed. Thomas had married late and had a young son, barely 5, who followed him around the workshop with evident adoration. And watching Thomas with his son, I saw a softness I'd never seen before, a tenderness that suggested healing, or at least the beginning of it. One evening, while the boy slept and William helped Thomas's wife in the kitchen, Thomas and I talked by the fire. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, "about what you told me years ago, about honoring the dead by living well. I didn't believe it then, couldn't believe it. But now with my son," he trailed off, staring into the flames. "What about him?" I prompted. "He doesn't know guilt," Thomas said. "He doesn't know the weight I carry. He just knows I'm his father, and he loves me, and he thinks I can do anything. And when I'm with him, I almost believe it myself. I almost forget that I'm just a placeholder, just whoever was left standing. With him, I'm just myself. Thomas the joiner, his father." "You were always just yourself," I said. "The guilt was something you added." "Maybe. But I needed it, I think. For a while. I needed to feel like I'd paid some price for surviving. But I'm tired of it now. I'm tired of carrying the dead with me everywhere. I want to live lightly, just for a while, just to see what it's like." This struck me as unutterably sad and unutterably hopeful at the same time. Here was a man who had spent 30 years in penance for the crime of not dying, finally allowing himself the possibility of joy. Here was a survivor learning how to live rather than merely exist. "Do it," I urged. "Live lightly. You've earned it." Have I, though? That's the question I can't answer. How do you earn the right to be happy when your happiness is built on mass graves? I thought about this carefully before answering. Maybe you don't earn it. Maybe it's not about earning. Maybe happiness, or at least contentment, is just what naturally happens when you stop fighting against it. When you stop insisting that you don't deserve it. Thomas laughed, but not unkindly. When did you become wise? I'm not wise. I'm just tired of suffering for no reason. I'm tired of feeling guilty for being born at the right time. I'm tired of carrying weights that aren't mine to carry. I leaned forward. The dead don't want our guilt, Thomas. They don't want anything. They're dead. What they might want, if they could want anything, is for us to live well, to not waste what they left us, to build something good from the ruins. You make it sound easy. It's not easy. It's the hardest thing in the world, but it's also the only thing worth doing. We talked late into the night, and something shifted between us. Not resolution exactly. Neither of us would ever fully escape the shadow of the pestilence, the knowledge that our lives were possible only because so many others had ended, but perhaps acceptance, perhaps the beginning of peace. The next day, I took William to see St. Paul's, as my father had taken me. And standing in that massive, half-empty space, I tried to explain to my son what it represented. This cathedral, I said, was built for a different world. A world with more people, more faith, more certainty about everything. That world is gone. But the cathedral remains, and we have to decide what to do with it. Do we maintain it exactly as it was, a monument to the past? Do we let it fall into ruin because we can't fill it? Or do we adapt it, find new uses for it, make it relevant to the world we actually live in? William thought about this. What should we do? I don't know. All three options have merit and cost. But I paused, trying to articulate something I'd only recently understood. I think we have to do all three at once. We maintain the structure, honor its past. We accept that parts of it will fall into disuse, that we can't preserve everything, and we find new ways to use it, new meanings for it that make sense for us. We honor and adapt and let go all at the same time. That sounds complicated. It is complicated. Life is complicated. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. We walked through the cathedral's echoing spaces, and I watched William seeing it with fresh eyes, not with my complicated mixture of reverence and guilt, but with simple wonder at its beauty and scale. He didn't feel the absence of the missing thousands the way I did. He just saw a magnificent building, impressive in its own right, and I realized that was okay. More than okay, it was right. Each generation had to see the world with its own eyes, not through the distorting lens of their parents' trauma. William would have his own challenges, his own sorrows, his own complicated relationship with the world. He didn't need mine. Father Benedict died in my 45th year, peacefully in his sleep at an age no one could precisely determine, but everyone agreed was remarkable. His funeral was attended by virtually everyone in the village and several neighboring villages, a testament to the decades he had served as priest, guide, and witness to the Great Dying and its aftermath. Standing at his graveside, I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the years, all his patient answers to my troubled questions, all the wisdom he'd dispensed, often reluctantly, always carefully. He had been one of the last living links to the world before the pestilence, one of the few who could remember what it had been like when England was full and every scrap had to be fought for. Now he was gone, and with him went a kind of memory that could never be recovered. He had known the old world as an adult, had participated in it, had understood it from the inside. Those of my parents' generation had been children when the pestilence came. They remembered it, but through a child's incomplete understanding. And my generation had only stories, second-hand accounts, shadows of shadows. The past was fading, not in the sense that it was being forgotten. We still told stories, still marked the anniversary of the Great Dying, still taught our children about what had happened, but it was losing its visceral reality, its emotional weight. It was becoming history rather than lived experience. I spoke with the new priest after the funeral, a young man barely 30 who had come from Oxford with a degree in theology and modern ideas about pastoral care. His name was Peter, and he listened thoughtfully as I tried to explain what Father Benedict had meant to the village. He remembered, I said. That was his gift. He remembered the world before, and he helped us understand what we'd inherited. Who will do that now? You will, Peter said simply. Your generation. You're the bridge now, old enough to have heard the stories firsthand, young enough to speak to the generation coming after. You're the ones who have to keep memory alive. This felt like a heavy burden suddenly thrust upon me. I was not wise like Father Benedict. I did not have his patience or his faith or his certainty. How could I possibly fill his role? But Peter smiled at my expression. Don't worry, you don't have to be him. You just have to be you, passing on what you learned. That's all any of us can do. Receive what we're given and pass it forward, hopefully improved a little by our stewardship. And if we fail? If the memory dies with us? Then it dies, Peter said with a shrug that seemed shocking in its casualness. Memory always dies eventually. That's not failure, that's time. What matters is what we build while we're here. The structures, the traditions, the ways of being that outlast individual memory. Those are what truly persist. I wasn't sure I agreed with him, but I couldn't articulate my objection. There was something too accepting in his attitude, too willing to let go. But perhaps that was the difference between his generation and mine. He had been born even later than me, into a world where the pestilence was already ancient history. He could afford to be philosophical about loss because he had never known the people who were lost. In my 50th year, William married. His bride was Margaret, the daughter of a merchant from Norwich, and she brought with her a substantial dowry and connections that would serve William well in his career. I had taught him everything I knew about the craft, and he had surpassed me in some areas, developing techniques and approaches that were entirely his own. The wedding was a grand affair by village standards, a feast that lasted 2 days, with music and dancing, and enough food to feed half the county. Watching the celebration, I was struck by how different it was from my own wedding, which had been a simpler, quieter event. We had more now, more food, more money, more leisure for celebration.